All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat. Mrs. Bracha Strimber, in memory for dedicating all of Shirman Drushos this month in memory of her husband Avram Ben Kalman Eliezer Halevi Zichron Livracha. To thank Ayala and Sarah Steinberg for dedicating all of Shirman Drushos this month in the schos of Refuah Shalema for Yishulamis Bas Susha. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Yehuda and Bracha Bocholter, in memory of Asher Zelig Ben Yaakov Yehuda Halevi Bocholter Zichron Livracha, who Shloshim is this coming Friday, Gimel Adar. To thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Saeed and Sima Hakin, in honor of the engagement of Eli Golfez. Where is Danielle? Danielle's right here. Mazel Tov, Trub Danielle. Shvizochem Yert Hashem. To go to the Chuppah B'Sha'ah Tova U'Mitzlachos. Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. All right, so with that, let us begin. A beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. I also want to give a very special welcome to our Daf Yomi Chevra. Apparently, we have a Daf Yomi Chevra in Sons of Israel, Allentown, Pennsylvania. So, welcome to our Daf Yomi Chevra from Allentown, Pennsylvania. A bracha, incredible schos, Baruch Hashem, to learn with everyone. All right, we'll say with that, let us begin. So we'll say, so today's daf is Chav Ches Amud Aleph, or say it's Amud Beis also, but in Meretz Hashem we'll get there. So we'll say we're starting on Chav Ches Amud Aleph. So we actually left off 2, 4, 6, 8 lines down from the top on Chav Ches Amud Aleph. So we'll say, remember again, we are going through a series of drashas here. Very interesting drashas regarding the ability to go ahead and repurpose carbonos. So remember again, the genesis of this entire conversation all has to do with this. Remember, all links back to the Mishnah. What was the Mishnah? The Mishnah ultimately, again, was the case of a woman who made the neder Nazirus. She became a Nazira. Husband was made for the neder. And then again, we had a variety of different cases where halacha l'maisa, the woman had either set aside animals or had set aside money for carbonos. So then the fundamental question becomes, what can you do in terms of the repurposing of those animals or of that money? So that led to a much broader discussion regarding the ability to take money or an animal designated for one type of carbon and to repurpose it for something else. We left off in the middle of these incredible series of drashos, all really based on the word carbono, his carbon, where the Gemara is teaching us that halacha l'maisa, really you're very limited in the ability to go ahead and use someone else's carbon, or for that matter, someone else's sacrificial money, in order to affect your own level of atonement. So we left off 8 lines down from the top, Chav Ches Amud Aleph 28a. Yochol lo yetzi bebehema shehifish liatzmo minakala ala kala o minachamura ala chamura. So we'll say, I'm going to thought as follows. Now we'll say here, this case is transitioning a little bit. In this case, I separated out a carbon to bring for me, right? So let's say, for example, I separated out a carbon to bring for a particular afarah. So I might have thought, I can't go ahead and take a carbon that I set aside for one afarah and use it for another afarah. Even if what? Minakala ala kala, even if we're talking about averos of the same level of severity. So I can't take a carbon set aside for one avera kala and use it for another avera kala. Or for that matter again, one avera chamura and say for another avera chamura. So the Gemara says, or afilu min akala ala chamura, or min chamura ala kala. So ultimately again, or I can't go ahead and use it. If I separate it out for an avera kala, I can't use it for a chamura. Or if I separate it for a chamura, I can't use it on a kala. Okay. So the Gemara says, for example, shekain im hifish behema ala chelev. For example, I will say, let's say I accidentally ate chelev. Chelev is forbidden fat. I accidentally ate chelev, and ultimately again, now I want to go ahead and use that, and then I also ate blood. It's been a tough day, right? So again, so now I went ahead and used that carbon that I separated out for chelev and use it for dam. Oh, ala dam vehevi ala chelev. Suppose I can't do that. Now why? This is very interesting. Why? Shahare lo ma'al v'lo chipar. Rabbi said this is very interesting. Because why? Because I did not commit me'ilah, and therefore it cannot affect kapara. Now, what's going on over here? So we'll see. I'll draw your attention to something very interesting. Take a look at the rush. So the rush is in the left-hand column, or the left-hand margin, I should say. and it's 2, 4, 5 lines down into the rush. Lo ma'al v'lo kiper. So Rabbi said, this is very interesting. Look what the rush says. Lo ma'al ba'osekein b'shogeg. So Rabbi said, now watch this. So let's play this out. I went ahead and I ate chaylev. I ate forbidden fat. So what did I do? I separated out a carbon. Okay. Then I also ate blood. So what did I do? I took the carbon that I was going to use for chaylev, and now I'm going to use it for blood, to atone for blood. To atone for the afarah of eating blood. So if I were to do so, I have not committed me'ilah. Then I both say, remember again, what's me'ilah? Me'ilah is unconsecrated use of consecrated items. So the Gemara says, Lo ma'al ba'osekein b'shogeg, de'ein me'ilah ela b'meshana me'reshus hekdish l'reshus hedyot b'shogeg. They will say, what is the definition of me'ilah? The definition of me'ilah is taking something that is in reshus hekdish, in the domain of hekdish, and now utilizing it in a chulindik fashion, in a mundane or unconsecrated way. Is that happening over here when I take the carbon that I was going to use for chaylev and I use it for dam? No. Why not? It's still in hekdish. Right? Granted, what I'm doing is I'm repurposing it in the world of hekdish, but I have not taken it from hekdish to chulin. So therefore, again, v'hacha mehekdish hekdish karmashani v'lo ma'al. So I will say in this case over here, halacha lamaisa. Again, because I'm not taking it from. Remember, it's just a technical issue. The concept of me'ilah. See what I say? We often erroneously term me'ilah as simple repurposing. That's not true. Me'ilah is only repurposing from kodesh, from hekdish to chulin. But from hekdish to hekdish is not good, but it's not called me'ilah. There, and I will say, now watch this. Therefore, hilchach, and I will say, because I have not committed me'ilah, hilchach lo kiper, v'lo yotza karba mecheskaso. I will say, this is fascinating. So because I have not committed me'ilah, what does that show? If I haven't committed me'ilah, what does that show? That I have not really affected any level of change. Well, if I haven't affected any level of change, guess what else I haven't done? I haven't affected kapara. Right? Why I will say? Because the truth is, to a certain degree, they're interdependent. In other words, the only way for me to go ahead and switch this carbon from chaylev to dam, right, is to switch its designation. Well, if its designation has been switched, then I should be in violation of what? Me'ilah. If I'm not in violation of me'ilah, what does that tell you? Designation hasn't been switched, right? Its original identity still remains intact, and therefore, if no me'ilah, no kapara. So it's a very interesting correlation between the two, right? In other words, so I'll say it one more time. Let me play it out here. I went ahead and I ate chaylev. I set aside a carbon. Then I decided, you know what? I also ate dam. So I decided, you know what? I'm going to use my carbon for dam, not for chaylev. So now I both say, so now I go ahead and repurpose. So what does the Gemara say? I have not committed me'ilah, and therefore I have not affected atonement for dam, for blood. What's the nature of that relationship? Let's go through this. I haven't affected me'ilah. Why not? Because it's still hektish. The definition of me'ilah is from kodesh to chol. That's the definition of me'ilah. So because I have not affected me'ilah, i.e. the original designation remains intact, well, if the original designation remains intact, then what? That means I haven't affected kapara for dam as well. Fascinating idea. So the Rush ends off, he says, V'chevan de b'shogeg lo kafar, din hu nami b'miskavein la'akor chatos chaylev v'la'asos achatov dam below keeper. Fine. Sif Rabbi said, the Gemara says as follows. Sher lo ma v'lo keeper. Aval. Rabbi say, now watch this. Aval. Yotzei b'ma'os shehifresh li'asmo. But I would have thought as follows. I should be able to go ahead and make this work with money. I will say, imagine the following scenario. I went ahead and I set aside money for a particular carbon. And now what do I want to do? So aval yotzei b'ma'os shehifresh li'asmo. Minakala lekala. So we'll say, so now imagine I set aside money for a particular carbonic purpose. Now I want to switch it. And I want to go from one afarah kala to another afarah kala. Or minachamur lechamura. Or I want to go from a more severe chait to another severe chait. Or minachamura lekala. Or from chamura to kala. Umikala lechamura. Shekain. Watch this. I'll say shekain. Im hefresh liatzmo maos minachelev. So we'll say, now watch this. For example, let's say I went ahead and ate chaylev, and what? I set aside money to purchase a carbon for my infraction, shahare ma'al v'kiper. So Rabbi said, now watch this. If I went ahead, I'm sorry, I skipped the line. Shekenim hifrish ma'os liatzma ma'os minachelev. If I set aside money to bring a carbon for a consumption of chelev, vehevi ala dam, and then I switch the money, and now I'm going to use the money to go ahead and bring a carbon for dam consumption. Vehevi ala dam, vehevi ala chelev, shari ma'al b'kiper. So we'll say in this case, you did commit mi'ila, and therefore because I did commit mi'ila, therefore what Rabbi say? I have affected kapara. Now, what does this mean? Watch this. Take a look at the rush again. Very interesting case. Shari ma'al v'kiper. Shamos ein bahen kedusha saguf. So also listen to this. Money, in general, doesn't have physical sanctity. What does money have? What does money have? Financial sanctity. Financial sanctity. So watch this. Shamos ein bahen kedusha saguf. Kishanosan liknos bahem behema l'sorach carbon acher. Yatsu l'chulin hilchal kiper. So also now watch this. Because money does not have financial, physical sanctity, it has financial sanctity, therefore it can be repurposed. Well, if it can be repurposed, that means what? You can transgress mi'ilah. And if you can transgress mi'ilah, what does that mean? That kapara could occur as well, that you could repurpose it for kapara. It's actually quite a fascinating correlation. To which the Gemara says, Talmud Lomar. So we'll say, remember again, there's all the Havamina. I would have thought I can do this. Talmud Lomar, al chataso. Ad sheyehei carbono l'shem chato. So we'll say, so what do you, again, same drasha. Al chato. So it's the same drasha as before. Carbono, al chato. So we both say it's the same possessive. Ultimately, again, the carbon has to be brought for the intended original purpose. Katani Maso, now what comes out of all of this? Now I will say, remember, how do we get into all of this? This whole discussion began with a discussion about a blemished behemoth. Right, the behemoth with a mum. So katani mihas behema. My love afilu balas mum. Now, say again, we're talking about an animal. So are we not talking about even if the animal has a mum, a blemished animal? Lo tamima. Now we're talking about an unblemished animal. Ava balas mum mai. We'll say so. What would be the status of a blemished animal? Kistuma danya. Now we'll say blemished animal would have the same status ultimately again as ma'os stumen, as unspecified funds. If that's the case, the Gemara says, "My area diktani ma'os shifrish aviv." If that's the case, then why even frame the case that I was talking about money? Listni balas mum. Go ahead and illustrate the case of unspecified funds, but instead of unspecified funds, use a blemished animal, and therefore that could teach me two halachas. Halachanami. The Gemara says, you're right, it's the same thing. Delamai chazya. They will say, what is a blemished animal fit for? Ultimately, again, ledami, right? Machaz ledami. So the Gemara says, dami hanumaos. The only thing a blemished animal will say ultimately is fit for is what? Is that halacha lamaisa, it's fit for its value. And therefore the blemished animal, inachinami, has the same status ultimately again as money. And therefore we'll say, the conclusion of the Gemara, here it is that behemas balas mum, that ultimately if you have an animal that is a blemished animal, it has the same status as ma'os stumos. Ultimately, again, as unspecified money. As unspecified money. But like going back, what's the status of unspecified money? Status of unspecified money is yiplu l'nidava. The whole thing goes to nidava. So I'll say if you were to plug in a behemas balmum into any of these previous cases, ultimately, again, the halacha, the status would be yiplu l'nidava. We'll say, I will just end off because there happens to be just an interesting case here, in general, about repurposing carbonos. So how do we paskin in this case like this, where you have a carbon set aside for a particular infraction, and then what happens? You end up violating something else. Can you go ahead and switch the carbon? I will say, just to keep it simple, let's assume for a moment even the averos in question have the same level of severity. So does it work to go ahead and create or affect a lateral transference of carbonos? So the Rambam Paskins in Hilchos Me'ilah, Parak Dalid Halacha Hey. A really interesting halacha. Listen to this. Hamafresh chatos al achilas chelef, ve'evia al achilas dam. See, here's the case. A person separated out a carbon chatos because he ate chelev, but then he also ended up eating dam, and he ended up using the carbon for dam. So he ended up bringing the carbon for dam consumption. What's talacha? Hare ze lo kiper lefichach lo mal. They both say you do not affect kapara. You do not affect kapara. Now, interestingly enough, it's the same correlation. Sounds strange. The reason you don't affect kapara is because there is no me'ilah. Then I'll say, what does that mean? If there was me'ilah, what would that show you? What would that show you? That you are affecting a transference. The fact that there's no me'ilah indicates to you, essentially, you haven't changed the status. This is still a chatos for chelev, even though you've repurposed it. It does not change the original status. So because of that, halacha l'maisa, because of that, there's no me'ilah, therefore there's no kapara. So right, however, listen to this. Hifrish, I will say, now what I just want to point out is, okay, so just to clarify this. So I have a chatos for I eat dam. Step one. Right? Step one. What did I do? Separate out carbon chatos. Good. Step 3. That's step 2. Step 3, I eat chelev. Right? Step 4, I decide, you know what? I'm gonna take my chatos that I had for dam and I'm gonna use it for chelev. So I will say, now the Rambam says low keeper. Now I will say, what does low keeper mean? Low keeper means essentially I've done nothing. In other words, that halacha l'maisa, I offered up this carbon, this chatas, for the sake of eating chelev. And I will say, did it work to atone for chelev? No. Why? Because you can't repurpose it. You can't repurpose it from chatas to chelev. But again, did it work for? I can't repurpose it from chelev to dam. Now, did it work to atone for chelev? No. Why not? Because you offered it up for the wrong purpose. So I will say, it's a little bit like nishtahin nishtaher. In other words, so you lost out on both ends. So the Maisa, it's not going to atone for chelev because you offered it up for dam. But it's not going to atone for dam because its original designation for chelev is locked in as well. So what did you do? You offered a carbon. Right? But you have not, in other words, but at the end of the day, you still have two outstanding obligations. Ultimately, again, for chelev and for dam. Now, the other case is hifrish mos lechatas chelev, the kana bahen chatas dam. So I will say, now, what about a money case? I set aside money to go ahead and purchase a chatas for a chelev consumption, and then I switched the designation of the money and I used it to purchase dam. I used it to purchase a chatas for dam. So what's the halacha? So I will say, b'shogei kipa lefichach mal. So I will say, this would actually be me'ilah. This would be me'ilah, right? So because it's me'ilah, the good news is, if it's me'ilah, that shows that what? There's a change in designation, and therefore it would work. So halacha l'maisa, again, if I did that, and then I went ahead and I brought the chatas for dam, in fact, it would work. Okay, so we'll say just an interesting halacha about carbonos. Beautiful. Now we'll say Mishnah. Mishnah says as follows: Nizrak ala echam. So I'll say, so back to Naziros. So an interesting case here. Nizrak ala echam adamim and yachal hafer. So we'll say, now listen to this. So this is very interesting. So now remember, back to the concept of afarah. Right? So remember again, husband has the ability to be made for his wife's nedarim, and of course naziros is a neder, which means the husband has the ability to annul his wife's neder naziros. What's the shaila? The shaila is, up until what point in time in the naziros process does he have annulment power? So listen to this. So nizrak ala echad min hadamim. So I will say, so now let's say, remember again, woman's going to bring, Nazir is going to bring 3 carbonos at the end of his or her neder naziros. So I will say, now watch this. So the Mishnah says, let's say, I will say now, so right, our typical case, Reuven's married to Rachel. Rachel is finishing up her neder naziros to the point that she's at the carbonos stage. So now remember again, she's going to bring a chatos, she's going to bring a shlomim, and she's going to bring an ola. Now, what happens? They're shechting the carbon, and she's at the stage now where the blood of one of the carbonos has been sprinkled on the mizbeach. So zrika has been done with even one of the carbonos. At that point, ein liyachal hafer. We'll say at that point in time, halacha l'maisa, husband no longer has the ability to be made for the neder. Now, what's the logic? Take a look at the rush. So we'll say it's actually, if you just take your finger and you go right across to the left-hand margin, it's right there. It's right there in the rush. So watch this. See where it says Mishnah nizrak ala echad min adamim en yachal hafer shela'achar zrikas echad min adamim himuteres biyayin ulatami lemesim v'lekasu inui nefesh hilchach lo matzi mefer. Now we'll say, remember again, When does a husband have the ability to be made for his wife's nedarim? When? I will say when. Only when what? There's inui nefesh. Right? Actually, I take it back. Right? You need one of two things. Really, one of two things. Either inui nefesh or little chazara. Dvarim beino lebeino. Right? Dvarim beino lebeino. Right? So again, right? Those are the two. One of those two criteria. Well, here's the interesting issue. Remember again, in general, the reason why a husband is able to go ahead and annul his wife's neder naziris is because it's inui nefesh. Right? Here's the problem. The Tanna Kama says, well, once the zrika of the dam, once you do one of the blood applications, essentially, all of the restrictions of naziros are lifted. There's no longer any restrictions. So therefore, she could drink wine. Therefore, Allah says she could eat meat. I'm sorry, she could become Tamil Mason. So therefore, Allah there are no restrictions. If there are no restrictions anymore, then halakha l'maaseh he has no right of revocation. Rabbi Akiva says, "Afilu nishchita ala achos mikala behemos en yachal hafer." Rabbi Akiva will say backs it up. Rabbi Akiva says even before zrika, halakha l'maaseh, once one of the carbonos has been shechted, husband no longer has the ability to be made for a neder. I will say, if you go back to the Rosh for just a moment, the Rosh says, Rabbi Akiva Savar, Shafilo Nishchat Velo Nizrak, in the Yachal Hafer. We're going to Rabbi Akiva holds that Allah, even before Zrika, once the carbonos have been shechted, ultimately again, he no longer has the power of revocation. And I will say, we're going to see that according to Rabbi Akiva is concerned about Hefsid Kodshim. Rabbi Akiva is concerned that if you allow a husband to be made for his wife's neder naziros after shchita, before zrika, then what? You're going to end up wasting carbonos. Right? Hefsid kachrim. It's going to be a loss of carbonos. We'll see in the Gemara what it means. Fine. So we'll say back to the Mishnah. We'll say, when is all of this so? B'taglachas hatara. So we'll say, we are talking over here about what we call taglachas hatara, which Rabbi say is the end of the naziros process. However, avaba taglachas hatuma yafer. Rabbi say, what's taglachas hatuma? Taglachas hatuma is the following situation. Let's say Rachel's a nazira and she becomes Timeya. So Rabbi say, what happens? So remember, we haven't gone through it yet, but the Gemara is going to go through it. Remember, the way it works is a Nazir becomes Tameh. So I will say, essentially what ends up happening is you do all of the concluding rituals and rites as if the Neder Naziros was being finished, but then what? You start it all over again. So just to be clear, when the Gemara says, for example, according to Tanna Kama, that halakha l'maaseh, a husband has the power of annulment up until the zrika of the dam, that's talking about the conclusion of the Neder Naziros. But if we're talking about a Nazir who became Tameh, right? Even after the Zrika, the husband has the power of annulment. Why? Makes a lot of sense. Why? Because then the Neder Nazir is just starting all over again, right? So again, just to be clear, according to the Tanna Kama, the fact that Zrika is the cutoff for annulment, or according to Rabbi Akiva, that Shchita is the cutoff for annulment, that's only when this represents the end of the Neder Naziros, what we call Taglachas Tara. But if again, this represents the restart of the Neder Naziros, i.e., the Nazira became Tameya, and therefore she's restarting. Everyone would agree that even after Zrika, even after Shchita, husband has the power of annulment. Incredible. Because the husband has the ability to say, I don't want an Isha Menuvelas. So I'll say, what's an Isha Menuvelas? Here the Rush defines this term. Perush Mu'una U'Menua Mishtias Yayin. So I'll say Menuvelas in this context, usually Menuvelas means like degraded. In this context, actually, the Rush understands it to mean, I don't want a wife who is afflicted and abstained from wine. I don't want that. In other words, the husband says, I don't want the wife who has to abstain from things. That's what he says. Fine. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Meir says, So it's very interesting. So Rabbi Meir is fascinating. Rabbi Meir comes along and says that he thinks that even by what we call taglachas tara, even by the actual concluding rites of Naziros, a husband has the ability to annul his wife's nedarim. But I will say, what this sounds like over here is, even after shchita according to Rabbi Akiva, even after zrika according to the Tanna Kama, a husband could still annul his wife's neder nazira. So we'll say why? Because what occurs even after zrika? Cutting of the hair. It's not just cutting of the hair, it's shaving of the head. Rabbi Meir says even after zrika, a husband has the ability to annul his wife's neder nazira. Why? Because he could say, Omer, af betaglachsa, shehu yachal omar, efshi biisha migalachas. Husband could say, I don't want my wife to shave her head. I don't want my wife to shave her head. So therefore, again, I will say halacha l'maisa, because for him, there is still an element of neder naziros, which, and again, it could be either inui nefesh or dvarim shebeino lebeino. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, he has the right to annul her neder naziros even after the zrika, according to Rabbi Akiva. Okay, we'll see all this in the Gemara. We'll say beautiful. Says the Gemara, Masnisin. So we'll say, so again, just to reframe what we have. What do we have in the Mishnah? We're focusing now as essentially at what point in time does the window for the husband's hafara close when it comes to his wife's neder naziros. Rabbi Akiva, he has up until zrika. Up until zrika. We always say, what's Rabbi Akiva's logic? Because Rabbi Akiva says post zrika, all of the isurim of naziros are permitted, and therefore halacha l'maisa, there's nothing to annul. Right? Remembering, I will say, the power of a husband's annulment is not the carte blanche. Right? His power to annul is only either inui nefesh or dvarim shebeino lebeina. Rabbi Akiva will say, once zrika is done, everything is permitted. Once everything is permitted, nothing more to talk about. Rabbi Meir, no, he only has up until shchita. Up until shchita to annul. Now again, I will say, Rabbi Meir, we're going to see, is much more concerned about hefsid kachim, about the loss of carbon. I'm sorry, that was Rabbi Meir. That was Rabbi Akiva. I'm sorry. Rabbi Akiva, he has up until the time of shchita. Good. I will say one more. Rabbi Meir, then we'll go back for just a second. Rabbi Meir says, no, he has even post-zrika. Post-zrika. According to Rabbi Meir, it sounds like husband could annul his wife's neder naziros up until which point in time she cuts her hair. Up until the time of taglachas, he has the ability to annul the neder. Now, I will say, Mishnah makes a very important qualification. What's the qualification? This entire discussion is talking about what we call taglachas tara. What's taglachas tara? The final concluding rites at the end of an neder naziros. But if Rachel, in our question over here, right, if Rachel became Tumeah, and therefore again is going through the rituals and rites to end one neder naziros but begin the next, everyone agrees that a husband has continued ability to go ahead and annul the neder naziros, because in this case again, the neder naziros itself is ongoing. Beautiful. Says the Gemara. I'll say 2 lines up from the bottom. Chav ches amud aleph. Says the Gemara. Masnisin lo Rabbi Eliezer. Our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Eliezer. Why? Because the Gemara says Rabbi Eliezer ha'amar taglachas ma'akeves. Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion that halacha l'maisa, it is hair cutting that prevents the restrictions from being lifted. Right? Which sounds actually like the position of Rabbi Meir. When it says that the Mishnah is not like Rabbi Eliezer, it means that the Tanna Kama is not reflecting the view of Rabbi Eliezer. Because also remember again, according to the Tanna Kama, at what point in time are the restrictions of Naziros lifted? When are they lifted? Zrika. Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion, when are the restrictions of Naziros lifted? Only after hair cutting, taglachas. So our Mishnah clearly does not reflect the view of Rabbi Eliezer. Therefore, again, the Gemara says, the hamar taglachas ma'keves, the chayvan de lo gilcha, and therefore, since she has not yet done her hair cutting, asura bechamra, she is not permitted to drink wine. The chayvan de isle nivel, and say because of that, because there's still an element of abstinence, she can't drink wine, matzi mefer. Ultimately, again, husband should still be permitted to be made for the neder. So obviously, our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Eliezer, because the Tanna Kama of our Mishnah says the restrictions are lifted after Zrika. And Rabbi Eliezer says the restrictions are lifted when? Only after Taglachus. So Bahapligi, so I will say Amud Beis. This is what the argument. I will say top of 28b, Chaf Ches Amud Beis. Here we go. Tana Didan Savar, our Tana holds, Kevan Diz Darakale Damla Alter Sharia Bechamra. So I will say, so listen to this. So our Tana holds that once Zrika is done, right? Once the sprinkling of the blood is done, ultimately, again, ultimately, she's immediately permitted in wine. Leslie Nivel, and therefore again we'll say there's no nivel. In other words, we'll say there's no abstinence. In other words, once zrika occurs, halacha l'maisa, she's done. She's done. So we'll say, now remember again, once she's done, therefore husband no longer has the ability to what? To be made for the neder. Okay, so the Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva says, afilu ishtachis behema eini yachal lahaver. Rabbi Akiva holds that no. Once you shecht the behema, once you shecht the carbonos, right? Ultimately, then the window of annulment closes. Why? Rabbi say mishum hefsid kachim. Rabbi say, now watch this. Rabbi Akiva is bothered by something else. Rabbi say, Rabbi Akiva is bothered by what we call hefsid kachim. Rabbi say, what's hefsid kachim? What is Rabbi Akiva worried about? Watch this. Let's play this out. Right? Rachel's in a zira. Now she's finishing up her neder naziros. They shecht her carbon. Now we'll say, Rabbi Akiva says like this. Now we'll say, we see something very interesting. Rabbi Akiva in concept agrees with the Tanakama. Right? You could see it. Rabbi Akiva really wants to agree with Tanakama. Right? Because Rabbi Akiva will say that halacha l'maisa, again, at what point in time, ultimately, again, are the restrictions really lifted? When are they really lifted? He wants to say they're really lifted at the time of zrika as well. Right? But what he's concerned about is if we do that, then Abba say, what happens? If we do that, then what happens to the carbon? So now you right, Rachel shechted her carbon for the conclusion of Nazirus. Now Abba say, so now the husband was made for the neder, so she's no longer a Nazira. Wonderful. What's the problem? You have a carbon that was already shechted. So what do you do with it now? So Rabbi Akiva says you're causing a loss to carbonos. Therefore, Rabbi Akiva says we cut off the window of revocation or annulment at the time of shchita. So maskifla Rabbi Zera. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Zera went ahead and raised the kasha. Va'amai. I don't understand Rabbi Akiva. Why do you have a problem here? Why can't we do the following? Va'amai. Lizrok daman shalol lishman v'yatir basar ba'achila. The truth is, there's a pretty simple answer. What can you do? Go ahead, and just offer it. In other words, I will say, just essentially, in other words, what the Gemara is suggesting over here is, just finish it up. Okay, I got it. You're not going to offer up the carbon as an offering for Naziros. So offer it up for Nadava. What's the big deal over here? So we'll say, take a look at the rush for just a moment. It's the top rush. So literally, again, Rabbi Zera says, I don't see what the big deal is over here. Just go ahead and do Zrika. And right, Zrika Shalosh. I will say now in this context again, just to be clear, Zrika Shalosh means what? When the animal was shechted, it was shechted for what purpose? For Naziros. Right? Can you offer it up for Naziros anymore? No. Why? The husband was made for the neder. So what the Gemara is suggesting over here is offer up to the Zrika, the shem nidava, and allow the meat to be consumed. What's the big deal? Look at the Rush for just a moment. The Rush says, Va'amai. Actually, no, before we get to the Rush, let's just read the rest of the Gemara. The Gemara says, Milo Tanya, did we not learn? Kivsei Atzeres, Sheshachtan Shalosh Man. Rabbi says, this is the offering by Shavuos. You have the Kivsei Atzeres, that were shechted Shalosh Shman. They weren't shechted for the purpose of Kivsei Atzeres. Oh, Sheshachtan Lifnei Zmanon, or he shechted them before Shavuos. Oli akar zmanon, or ultimately again after their zman. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Hadam yizrak. Ultimately again, the blood is sprinkled. Va'basa yochal, and ultimately the meat can be consumed. Now we'll say, what do you see from here? That if you have a carbon that was offered up shalol lishman, ultimately again it can be repurposed for nadava. V'ma'isa Shabbos. Well, here's the difference. If you shechted it on Shabbos, lo yizrok, then ultimately again you don't do this zrika on Shabbos. V'mzarak hortza lahakdrei mur le'erev. And if you did so, you can go ahead and offer up the sacrificial parts on Motzei Shabbos. So we'll say fine. So in other words, leave that Shabbos part on the side. But the point is, what does it teach us? That if you offer up a carbon shalol lishma, right, ultimately repurpose it for nadava, it works. So Rabbi Akiva, what are you concerned about over here, right? Well, let's just take a step back for just a moment. What Rabbi Akiva is doing is Rabbi Akiva is rolling back the window of afarah, right? Rabbi Akiva is saying, in reality, it sounds like, Rabbi Akiva wants to agree with the Tanakama, that really a husband should be able to be made for his wife's neder up until when? Up until Zrika, but he's rolling it back to Shchita because he's concerned about Hefsid Kachim, causing a loss ultimately, again, causing a loss for Carbonos. The Gemara says, why should it be a loss? Why should it be a loss? What's the worst case scenario? Right? Rachel shechter carbon, Reuven is made for her neder. No problem. Just offer it up shalol lishman. The meat's going to be permitted, and that's it. That's it. What is the big deal here? Well, say if you take a look at the now look at the Rush. Just before we get to the punchline, look at the Rush. Rush says over here, top Rush. V'amay v'lizro k'dam shalol lishman b'yater basar b'achi lo disnan kol azvakam shnizbechu shalol lishman ksherim ela shalol alu l'shem chova. V'lav dafka shalol lishman chua din afilu b'stama midinami de'ein staman omdin lishman achar shefer labayla. So we'll say, essentially what the Gemara is saying is, look, we have a precedent for this. We have a precedent where halacha l'maisa, you could take a carbon, offer it up shalol lishma or even stam, and it works. So it's fine. So now ultimately, again, Rachel shechted her carbon. I mean, she didn't literally shecht her carbon, but the carbon was shecht on her behalf, and then her husband was made for her neder. No problem. You could still offer that up. To which the Gemara says, listen, Amri, so Rabbi Akiva will respond to this, and he'll say, Idi shachet olo shlamim hachanami. Remember again, that is true, right? Solid point. Assuming that we're talking about what? The offering up of an olah or a shlamim. However, hachab mayaskinon, they will say, what's the case here? What's the case here? Kigon sheshachat chatos bereisha. They will say, it's interesting, by the way, how all roads always lead back to the chatos, right? The chatos is the complicating factor in this. They will say, because where does a problem come up? They will say, so again, if she's shechting her olah first, you're right. You're right. What's the worst case scenario? Right? She shechted her olah thinking that she was in a zira. After the shechita, her husband was made for the neder. What can you do with the olah? What can you do with the olah? Fine, no problem. Do zrika, shalol lishman, you can eat. Fine. Shlamim, same thing. What's the problem? The problem is the chatas. The problem is the chatas. So we'll say, kidisnan, im gilach al achas mishlashtan yasa. Shirbo say, here's the problem. The problem ultimately, again, is halacha l'maisa where you get to a chat. Shirbo say, a shlamim can be offered up shalol lishma. An olah can be offered up shalol lishma. A chatos cannot be offered up shalol lishma. So Shirbo say, what would happen? What would happen in a case where Rachel's in a zira, and Abba say, she shechts her, now Abba say, now again, in the concluding sacrifices, is there an order in which the carbonos need to be shechted? The answer is no. They can be shechted in any order. Therefore, it's feasible that the first carbon she shechts is her chatos. So let's play this out. If she shechts her chatos, and then right after the sheet of the chatos, husband is made for her neder. So we'll say, what's the halacha now? What's the halacha? That chatos is yotzi lebeis hasreifa. Right? There's nothing to do with that chatos. You can't offer it up. That's what Rabbi Akiva is concerned about. 2 out of the 3, everyone agrees, yeah, no problem. Even if shechita was done and then afarah takes place after the shechita, no problem. Just do the zrika, offer it up shalom l'shma, shalom al Yisrael. The problem is if the chatos was offered, then we're stuck. So that's what Rabbi Akiva is concerned about. And in order to stave off a loss to kachim, Rabbi Akiva says the window for annulment closes right after shechita. Incredible. So we'll say that's the first part of the Gemara. So we'll say, when is this? So we'll say, when is remember again, the Mishnah gave an important qualification. What was the qualification? This entire machlokes is only talking about the actual conclusion of the Neder Nazirus. But if she became Tmeya, and therefore again was doing the concluding rites of Nazirus, and then what? Restarting, everyone agrees that she has the power of annulment. That he has the power of annulment, even after Zrika. So Rabbi Meir, now Rabbi Meir takes it even further, right? Rabbi Meir holds the halacha l'maisa, a husband has the power to annul his wife's neder naziris even post Zrika, up until the time of hair cutting. Rabbi Meir Omer afilu b'teglachas tara yafer mipnei sheyachal lomar efshi b'isha megalachas. Right, because Rabbi Meir holds that a husband has a right to say, he can be for the neder. Why? He doesn't want his wife to shave her head. Right? So to him, ultimately, again, I don't want that. So therefore, Allah Chalamaisa, he has the ability to make for the neder. So both say this is interesting. So the Tanakama, so both say, by the way, so this is quite fascinating. So now the Gemara is essentially bothered by Tanakama, why don't you hold the same thing? Others will say, Obviously, the wife shaving her head is a pretty big thing, right? That could potentially be dvarim shebeino lebeina. So ultimately, again, so why wouldn't the Tanakama ultimately allow annulment hafaras haneder up until the time of taglachas? So it's very interesting. Tanakama amar lecha efshar bepei nachris. Tanakama says she could wear sheitel. She could wear sheitel. Right? In other words, so fine, she's going to have to shave her head, but that's fine. In other words, that she'll have a sheitel. So the Gemara said, listen to this. Ramir Savar, the Pe'anachris Aidi Dizuama Lo Nichale. This is fascinating. Ramir says, no. For the husband, the thought that his wife is going to be wearing someone else's hair, right, is fundamentally repulsive to him. And therefore, Allah Lamaisa, that's still grounds for annulment of the neder. So I'll say really quite fascinating. So it's a fundamental shayla ultimately, again, on whether or not the use of a sheitel is enough to ameliorate or to somehow alleviate, or at least address this potential nivul. So according to Tanakama, yes. According to Rabbi Meir, ultimately no. I will say if you take a look at the Rush again, a very interesting Rush. So the Rush says, Rabbi Meir Savar, he says, Demizuham be'eni abal, shetitein ishto arosha, sear isha nochris. Very Rabbi Meir holds the thought that the wife is going to be wearing someone else's hair on her head is something ultimately, again, that is repulsive to the husband. Interesting. And therefore, Allah Kalamaisa is grounds for hafara. So therefore, Allah say, Allah Kalamaisa, we're left with a fundamental machlokes as to at what point in time in the Nazirus of the wife does the husband have the power of hafara. So once again, we have a three-way machlokes. We have the Tanakama telling us husband has up until Zrika. Right? We have Rabbi Akiva telling us husband has up until Shchita, and then we have Rabbi Meir telling us husband has up until Taglachas. So how do we paskin? So I'll say the Rambam in Hilchos Naziros, Perek Dalet Halacha Yud Zayin says as follows: Ha'isha shenadra b'Naziros v'shalmu yimei ha'Naziros ve'evia karbonosel v'nishcheta achas min ha'behemos v'nizrak dama v'achar kach shama baila afapi sha'adayin lo gilcha eno yachal lahafer v'imkodem zrika hare zeyafer. So I'll say ultimately again the Rambam paskins like the Tanakama. Rambam paskins like Tanakama, namely husband has the power of hafara up until zrika. Up until zrika. Once you're past zrika already at that point in time, halacha l'maisa, no longer a power of hafara. And I'll say the logic being, what's the logic? Because after zrika, what happens? Everything becomes mutter. And once everything becomes mutter, it's no longer called a matter of inui nefesh. And since it's no longer a matter of inui nefesh, therefore the husband no longer has the power of hafara. Now I will say, that being said, the Rambam does accept the qualification of the Mishnah. Namely, what are we talking about? What is it talking about? Taglachas tara. This is mamish the conclusion of the Neder Naziros. But if she became Tameya and is going through what appears to be the concluding rites in order to what? Restart the Neder Naziros, then husband has the ability to marry for the Neder even when? Even after Zrika. Even after Zrika. So Rabbi says, Tanakama, window for Hafara is up until Zrika. After Zrika, no longer any ability for Hafara, as long as we're talking about the actual concluding rites of the Neder Naziros. But if she became Tameya and is going through the concluding rites in order to restart, everyone agrees in that case, it's logical. Since the Neder Naziros is ongoing, she has the ability ultimately, he has the ability to be made for it even after Zriga. Incredible. Let's say Mishnah. We actually made reference to this Mishnah at the end of last week. Ha'ish Madir Espino ben Nazir. This was a very interesting case. A father can make his son a Nazir. Father can make his son a Nazir. Ve'ena ish Madir Espino ben Nazir. But a mother does not have the ability to make her son a Nazir. Keitzad. So we'll say, how does this work? So we'll say, Keitzad. Kilach oshel gilchul krovav. So we'll say, when we say Keitzad, it's actually interesting. Normally, when the Mishnah says a principle and then says Keitzad, so the Keitzad is there to illustrate how the principle works. That's not what this means over here. In this case, here's the principle. A father has the ability to make his son a Nazir. Okay? A mother does not have the ability. The Keitzad here is telling us, ultimately, again, how this Neder Nazirus can be unraveled. So Keitzad, Kilach oshel gilchul krovav. So we'll say, if the son took a haircut, or the relatives gave him a haircut, Micha, or the son objected, or the relatives objected, right? That ends the Neder Nazirus. So Rabbi say, so as much as the father can make his son a Nazir, the ability to unravel this Nazirus can either be done by the son himself or by other relatives who are objecting to the Neder Nazirus on the son's behalf. Okay? Rabbi say, now what happens again? So in this case over here, father made his son a Nazir. Not only that, you can remember, Rabbi say, in this case, we're going to see, this only works, by the way, when the son is a katan. So obviously, because the son is a katan, who is going to have sacrificial liability for this Neder Nazirus? The father. So what did the father do? He made his son a Nazir, and he also separated out animals for his son's concluding Carbonos. So I'll say, so now let's say again, let's say the father actively identified, this is the Chatos, this is the Ola, this is the Shlamim, and now we'll say, so now what happens? Now the son objected to the Naziros, or the relatives objected, so what do you do with the animals? So Chatos Tamos, so the Chatos animals left to die, we already learned this, Chatos left to die, Ola Tikrav, the Ola ultimately is offered up as an Adava. So Va'ola Tikrav Ola, Ushlamim Yikrav Ushlamim. The Shlamim is offered up as, Shlam is also offered up as an Adava. V'ne'echalin liyom echad, they are consumed ultimately again for one day. Ve'inan tu'unin lechem. And ultimately again, they do not require loaves. What's the right way you did this already? They do not require the typical loaves of the Neder Naziros. What happened if the father set aside unspecified funds? Yiplu l'nedava. Ultimately, again, the entire pot falls to nedava. Most mifurashim. What if he had specified funds? So the mechatos yechol yamamelach. So again, ultimately, the money for the chatos that goes to yamamelach. Lo nanin v'lo molin. Ultimately, again, I will say you can't get hana, but if you did so, there's no me'ilah. Dime ola yaviu ola. The ola money ultimately is used to purchase olas nedava, umola and bahen, and ultimately you could commit mi'ilah with it. Not that you can commit mi'ilah. In other words, if you mi'ilah can be transgressed with this. The shlamim yaviu shlamim. The shlamim money ultimately again is used for shlamim nedava. The nechal liyom echad. Ultimately, it's consumed for one day. Ve'inan tu'unin lechem. And Rabbi say it does not require lechem. Does not require any kind of bread. So if Rabbi say this last part, we've already learned, right? Rabbi say we're experts in this, right? So remember again, to review the last part of the halacha. Whenever you have unspecified funds, what happens with unspecified funds? Yiplu l'nedava. Specified funds, chatas money yamamelach, ola money, olas nedava, right, and shlamim, and ultimately again shlamim nedava as well. Specified animals, chatos animal left to die, shlamim offered up as an nedava, olas offered up as an nedava. We'll say we'll stop over here for today, and Mirat Hashem will pick up with the mechanics of a father being Nadir son Neder Nazirus. Mirat Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach. I'm sorry? Leaving today, Mirat Hashem. So I will be in touch with Mirat Hashem over the next